Hey guys, tonight we'll go back in time to the very last breath of a legendary queen. Queen Elizabeth I ruled for 45 years, and in death, she didn't just leave a throne behind, she left a riddle. In her private chamber, her closest advisors found a single, unsealed, and unsigned letter. What was written in that final message that made hardened men fall silent, their faces frozen in shock? Was it a confession, a final act of revenge, or a secret so dark it could shatter her entire legacy? The letter disappeared, but its mystery lingers on. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Before we begin, tell me where you're from in the comments and what time it is for you right now. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. When Queen Elizabeth I drew her final breath, England did not simply lose a monarch, it lost a mystery. For 45 years she had reigned alone, without husband, without heir, without a named successor. Her life was a fortress built of iron willpower, whispered secrets, and a flawless public image. Yet in the moment her heart stilled. All the grand designs and glittering pageantry gave way to silence. After her passing at Richmond Palace in 1603, her most trusted advisors entered her private apartments, expecting royal decrees, jeweled treasures, perhaps a few personal letters or sacred texts. Instead, they discovered a single letter, unsealed, unaddressed, unsigned, simply waiting on her writing desk. The courtiers gathered around that fragile sheet of parchment in hushed astonishment. Not one of them spoke. No hand reached to touch the fragile paper. It seemed as though time itself had paused, holding its breath in reverent curiosity. What truth could have been penned upon that blank-seeming page? Was it a confession of guilt? A final warning from a dying queen? Or something far darker? A secret she had carried in silence for decades? Some whispered that the letter named a hidden heir, a private act of duty at the very end. Others believed it offered an intimate, devastating glimpse into her lonely mind, a mind that had ruled through love, denied, and enemies disguised as friends. But there was one theory more chilling than any other. What if that letter contained her ultimate confession that the flawless face she had presented to the world, painted with lead and lined with mercury, had been slowly killing her all along? That the very image defining her reign was also her silent undoing? To uncover what Elizabeth might have written in that moment, we must turn back the clock. To unravel the mystery, we must first understand the girl behind the crown. She was the daughter of an executed queen, the child of a king who abandoned her. She was the woman who built an empire while refusing herself a life beyond the throne. This is not merely the story of a ruler. It is the story of the price one pays to become legend. And somewhere in the shadow of that price lies the lost letter. To interpret its meaning, we begin not with power, but with pain. On the 7th of September in 1533, Elizabeth Tudor entered the world amid chaos and suspicion. Her mother, Anne Boleyn, embodied every trait deemed improper for a lady of the court: bold, opinionated, and irresistibly ambitious. Anne did not simply capture King Henry's interest. She consumed him utterly. He tore his kingdom apart to have her, breaking from the Catholic Church, and discarding his queen of 20 years to claim Anne as his lawful wife. All for a single, desperate hope, that she would bear him a son. When Elizabeth arrived as a daughter rather than the promised male heir, the king's joy soured into silence. Instead of celebration, there was disappointment. Instead of praise, there was a cold, stony hush. For a fleeting moment, Anne Boleyn tried to stand firm, pouring her energy into raising her child, as though preparing Elizabeth for a destiny that might still embrace her. But Henry's affection slipped away like sand through his fingers, and his gaze drifted toward more obedient companions. 3 years later, the court's darker currents swept Anne into a whirlwind of false accusations: adultery, incest, and high treason. Truth held little weight in Tudor England. Power alone prevailed. On the 19th of May in 1536, Anne was executed by French sword, quick, precise, and brutally final. Elizabeth was only 2 years old, left motherless and vulnerable in a court where smiles could hide daggers. Barely 11 days after her mother's fall, Henry remarried Jane Seymour, a gentle and compliant noblewoman who bore him the golden child he longed for. From that day forth, Elizabeth was not a cherished daughter, but a living reminder of Anne's disgrace. Declared illegitimate, her status stripped away, her future uncertain. Yet even then, the young princess did not break. She watched, she listened, she endured a world where love was transactional, loyalty lethal, and women often expendable. And so, before Elizabeth ever donned a crown, she bore the weight of history. Her father's ambition, her mother's shadow, and the spectre of betrayal that haunted every corridor of power. The girl who no one wanted was quietly becoming the woman no one would forget. In 1533, a storm began to brew. Elizabeth Tudor entered the world not amid fanfare but amid suspicion. It was the 7th of September in 1533. England was in turmoil, and at the heart of that firestorm stood her mother, Anne Boleyn. Anne embodied everything that a proper lady of the court was not supposed to be. Bold, outspoken, and fiercely ambitious. She did more than capture King Henry's attention, she set his very soul aflame. Henry VIII did not simply fall in love. He tore his kingdom asunder to claim her. He severed ties with the Catholic Church, cast aside his queen of 20 years, Catherine of Aragon, and declared Anne his lawful wife. All for one reason. He believed she would bear him a son. Yet when Anne gave birth to a daughter, Elizabeth, the king's dream shattered overnight. Instead of jubilant celebrations, there was bitter disappointment. Instead of proud accolades, there was oppressive silence. In that fleeting moment, Anne fought to retain her foothold. She poured every ounce of her energy into nurturing Elizabeth, preparing her as though the little princess could still matter in the king's eyes. But Henry's affections waned. His gaze wandered. His fury grew. 3 years later, the crown's dark currents swept Anne into their vortex. She was arrested, charged with adultery, incest, and high treason charges almost certainly fabricated by her enemies at court. In Tudor England, truth held no sway. Power alone reigned supreme. On the 19th of May in 1536, Anne Boleyn met her end at the executioner's sword. It was swift, precise, and ruthlessly final. Elizabeth was only 2 years old. She would never see her mother again. But the world would ensure that Elizabeth never forgot the accusations that had torn her mother from life. Worse still, merely 11 days after Anne's downfall, Henry remarried Jane Seymour, a noblewoman of gentle disposition, obedient and unassuming, who would at last grant him the son he so desperately craved. That boy, Prince Edward, was hailed as the golden heir. From that moment forward, Elizabeth ceased to be the cherished daughter of a king and became a living reminder of the queen he had erased. Declared illegitimate, stripped of her royal status, her future hung in the balance. Yet even amidst that profound loss, Elizabeth did not crumble. She watched, she listened, she endured. She grew up in a world where love was a transaction, where loyalty could be fatal, and where women might be discarded without a second thought. And it was within that crucible of betrayal, bloodshed, and abandonment that a future monarch was forged. Before she ever donned a crown, Elizabeth carried the weight of history upon her slender shoulders, not just her father's ambition, but the lingering shadow of her mother's tragic fate. As a child, Elizabeth learned the perilous art of silence. In the hushed corridors of the court, she observed how a single careless word could spell ruin. She internalized the truths her tutors imparted. History, politics, and philosophy were not mere academic pursuits, but tools of survival. She mastered Latin, Greek, French, and Italian, not for idle curiosity, but to arm herself against any who might underestimate her intellect. Each phrase she spoke was measured, every glance carefully calculated. She understood that in the Tudor court, power lay not only in the sword but also in the mind. Elizabeth's early years were marked by constant upheaval. She moved between palaces and castles, cared for by a revolving cast of governesses and attendants. She watched one stepmother driven away, another stripped of rank, and one Catherine Howard led to the block, echoing her own mother's fate. By the age of 10, Elizabeth had witnessed the deadly consequences of power played without mercy. Yet she did not rage against her lot. She absorbed its lessons, cultivating a resolve as unyielding as steel. When her half-brother Edward ascended the throne, Elizabeth's precarious standing deepened. Edward VI, adored as the boy king, reigned in name, but the real authority rested with his male regents. They viewed Elizabeth's lineage female and tied to Anne Boleyn's troubled legacy as a threat to their dominion. In that climate, Elizabeth kept her counsel close. She honed her ability to read the intentions hidden behind courteous smiles and practiced the art of gracious neutrality amid competing factions. Edward's untimely death plunged the kingdom into uncertainty. Elizabeth's half-sister Mary, daughter of Catherine of Aragon, claimed the crown as Mary I. Known to history as Bloody Mary, she was a devout Catholic who regarded her Protestant sister, her mother's daughter, as a heretic. Elizabeth found herself imprisoned in the very tower where her mother had awaited execution. For 2 harrowing months, she lived on the knife's edge of fate, uncertain whether she would emerge with her life intact. Through it all, she remained composed, never uttering a word that might incriminate her, never signing anything that could be used against her. She endured in silence. When Mary I died in 1558, Elizabeth stepped onto the throne at the age of 25. She emerged not as a victim, but as a master of the court's perilous game. She understood that her legitimacy was fragile, that her throne rested upon the goodwill of a weary populace. England was wounded by religious strife and drained by executions. Yet when Elizabeth appeared before her people, she conveyed reassurance, unity, peace, and strength. Her speeches, her portraits, and her grand processions were all carefully orchestrated acts of statecraft. She built a persona of the Virgin Queen, untouchable and eternal, presenting her flawless image as both protective armor and political weapon. But beneath that alabaster mask lay the scars of her past. The loss of her mother, the repudiation of her birth, the constant threat of betrayal, all had shaped her into a sovereign who knew the true price of power. And even as she cultivated beauty and grace, she bore in her heart the memory of the woman who had dared to defy a king, only to pay with her head. Elizabeth Tudor, the girl born into suspicion, had become the legendary queen who would outlive enemies, outwit rivals, and endure in the annals of history. After her mother's execution and her father's chilling indifference, Elizabeth was not merely left behind, she was abandoned, unprotected. The royal court had become a battlefield where smiles served as weapons and loyalty could cost you your life. Born the daughter of a disgraced queen, Elizabeth found herself neither fully embraced by royalty nor completely cast aside, just precariously balanced between the two, and therefore all the more dangerous. From one noble household to another, she was shuffled, living under the rule of successive stepmothers. She saw one die in childbirth, another cruelly exiled, and a third, Catherine Howard, sent to the block in the same ghastly fashion as her own mother. By the time Elizabeth reached the age of 10, she had witnessed firsthand what power could do to women. It could crown them with diamonds only to crush them in blood. Yet she did not rage against this injustice. Instead, she became an astute observer, learning the deadly game better than any other player. She mastered the art of silence, becoming an expert at reading hidden intentions behind courtly gestures. She immersed herself in languages Latin, Greek, French, and Italian, not out of mere scholarly curiosity, but as vital tools for survival in a world where missteps were fatal. She devoured history, politics, and philosophy, recognizing that every lesson gleaned might serve as a shield against the ever-present threats lurking in palace corridors. With each passing day, Elizabeth measured her words with utmost care and calculated every friendship. She understood that a single misplaced trust could send her head to share the scaffold with her mother's. This keen sense of caution extended even to her relationship with her half-brother, Edward VI. Though Edward held the title of king, the real power lay in the hands of the men who governed behind him. Those regents, wary of Elizabeth's keen intellect and potent lineage, viewed her as a rival rather than as a supportive sibling. Their fear of her potential only deepened Elizabeth's resolve to tread carefully, to speak sparingly, and to observe relentlessly. When Edward VI died in his youth, the question of succession threw the realm into fresh disarray. Elizabeth's half-sister, Mary Tudor, the daughter of Catherine of Aragon, claimed the throne as Mary I. Known to history as Bloody Mary, she was a devout Catholic who viewed Elizabeth the Protestant and the child of Anne Boleyn as heretical and dangerous. Elizabeth was confined to the Tower of London, the very same fortress where her mother had languished before her grisly end. For 2 dreadful months she lived in terror, uncertain whether she would emerge alive or join the ranks of the condemned. Throughout that harrowing imprisonment, Elizabeth remained remarkably composed. She spoke no foolish words that might be twisted into evidence against her, and she signed nothing that could serve as a death warrant. In the suffocating silence of her cell, she clung to patience and restraint, knowing that any sign of desperation could seal her doom. And when at last she was released, she did not protest her confinement, nor cast blame upon her sister. Instead, she simply endured, carrying forward the lesson she had learned. Survival in this world required more than bravery, it demanded eloquence in stillness. When Mary Tudor died in 1558, Elizabeth stepped from the shadows at the age of 25, not as a battered victim, but as a sovereign who had honed her mastery through suffering and exile. She emerged with a new strength, an understanding that power could be wielded as much through what remained unspoken as through public decree. She donned the mantle of leadership with the same precision she had once applied to her words, now wearing silence itself as a crown. Elizabeth's frail figure belied a formidable presence. As she assumed the throne, she carried the indelible scars of her past. The memory of her mother's downfall, the sting of her father's rejection, the solitude of her youth, and the knowledge that every ally might turn on her in the turn of a whisper. Yet she transformed these vulnerabilities into her greatest assets, forging an almost mystical aura of untouchability. In a court rife with intrigue, Elizabeth's silence became her signature, commanding attention and respect in equal measure. No longer a mere pawn in other people's schemes, Elizabeth now played the game on her own terms. Every public appearance was choreographed, every decree strategically issued, every gesture imbued with calculated meaning. She maintained a delicate balance between accessibility and enigma, offering just enough warmth to inspire loyalty, just enough distance to preserve her mystique. Yet behind the porcelain mask and the regal composure lay the same girl who had endured so much quiet, watchful, and always acutely aware that her position depended on her unerring ability to navigate the treacherous currents of power. In those early months of her reign, Elizabeth did not seek vengeance. She did not punish Mary's former advisors, or retaliate against those who had tormented her. Instead, she extended an olive branch of cautious reconciliation, demonstrating her skill as a diplomat as well as a monarch. She knew that stability would serve her kingdom far better than blood feuds, and in extending grace, she subtly reminded her subjects of the emptiness that follows terror and revenge, choosing instead to define her legacy by unity and prudence. Thus, Elizabeth Tudor moved from the perilous halls of her youth into the grand stage of national leadership. Every lesson learned in silence and suffering shaped her into a queen who could outlast conspiracies, outmaneuver rivals, and command the loyalty of a weary nation. Through the crucible of betrayal, imprisonment, and exile, she forged an indomitable spirit, one that would guide England through decades of religious strife, naval triumphs, and cultural rebirth. And though she wore the crown with poise and dignity, she never forgot that her greatest strength lay in the very shadows she once navigated, the silent spaces between words, the unspoken truths of the human heart, and the quiet resolve that can outlast any storm. When Elizabeth finally ascended the throne in 1558, the whole realm held its breath. She did not merely inherit a crown, she inherited a nation torn asunder by religious violence, fractured loyalties, and fresh, painful memories of executions. England was wounded. Its people were exhausted, their hearts heavy with loss and fear. And standing before them was a young woman many had once dismissed as illegitimate. Yet Elizabeth had learned to transform perception into power. From the very beginning of her reign, she mastered the art of royal theatre. Every speech she delivered, every portrait she commissioned, every procession she led was carefully crafted to make her subjects forget what they feared and believe in what she promised: unity, peace, and strength. But she also understood that in a world dominated by men, appearance was everything. In the 16th century, a queen's visage was not merely vanity, it was policy. Beauty equated to authority. Paler skin symbolized purity, nobility, even divinity. The whiter one's complexion, the higher one's status. And no one embodied this principle more than Elizabeth herself. Her signature look, porcelain white visage, deep crimson lips, and high forehead was not only iconic but strategic. Yet maintaining that image came at an enormous cost. In 1562, just 4 years into her reign, Elizabeth contracted smallpox. She survived the illness by a narrow margin, but it left her face permanently scarred and her hair thinner than before. For a monarch whose legitimacy was already under scrutiny, these blemishes were far more than cosmetic flaws, they were existential threats. So Elizabeth devised a new mask. She turned to Venetian ceruse, a cosmetic concoction of white lead and vinegar. Applied daily, it bestowed upon her an eerily smooth, ghostly complexion, concealing the pockmarks and instilling an almost supernatural aura of youth and vitality. To all who beheld her, she appeared flawless, an untouchable queen who never aged. Yet, beneath that alabaster armor lurked poison. Ceruse was toxic. Day after day it corroded the delicate layers of her skin. Over time, it caused hair loss, painful skin ulcers, and deeper, more insidious damage within her body. Combined with mercury-based lip rouges and cleansing pastes, Elizabeth unwittingly subjected herself to a slow, silent death. And still she persisted. For the illusion was more than mere beauty, it was her throne. Each time she emerged before her people, they saw not a woman ravaged by illness, but a monarch untouched by time. She had become a living myth, and myths do not bleed, they do not falter, they do not age. Elizabeth Tudor had become a masterpiece of deception, a masterpiece that demanded daily sacrifice. Despite the mounting physical toll, she continued the ritual without hesitation. Every morning, her ladies of the bedchamber would mix the ceruse paste to just the right consistency, then delicately layer it across her cheeks, forehead, and chin. The acrid scent of vinegar clung to her skin, mingling with the faint odor of metallic lead. Under the court's candlelight, the mask cracked in delicate fractures, revealing glimpses of vulnerable flesh beneath. But Elizabeth never showed discomfort. She bore the stinging burn and the flaking crust like a badge of sovereignty. To the world, she remained the radiant, unchanging queen. Year after year, the effects of the toxic mask became undeniable. Her once white teeth blackened. Strands of her auburn hair fell away in clumps, exposing pale, fragile scalp. Beneath the layers of ceruse, her skin became brittle and inflamed. Some observers noted that her hands trembled ever so slightly, perhaps a sign of mercury poisoning. Yet in every public appearance, she wore unwavering poise. Her garments were sumptuous, her jewelry resplendent, her posture regal. The people saw not the hidden cost, but the enduring symbol of stability and grandeur. In the midst of this facade, Elizabeth remained acutely aware of her growing vulnerability. She understood that her carefully cultivated image was also a dangerous liability. Should the mask fail in public or reveal signs of decay, the whispers of weakness would spread through the court like wildfire. Thus, she reinforced her legend through bold displays of power. She dispatched the Spanish Armada in 1588, safeguarding Protestant England. She patronized poets, playwrights, and painters, fostering a cultural renaissance. She navigated intricate alliances with skillful diplomacy. Every achievement reinforced the narrative of the Virgin Queen, eternal and sovereign. Yet, in the solitude of her chambers, Elizabeth felt the weight of her sacrifices. The nightly rituals of cleansing and reapplication were accompanied by moments of quiet reflection. She gazed into her looking-glass, tracing the lines and cracks that marred her complexion. Each fissure mirrored the scars of her past. Her mother's execution, her own imprisonment under Mary Tudor, the betrayals of fickle courtiers. In those moments, she confronted the paradox of her reign. A woman who had survived treason, exile, and disease, yet now found herself imprisoned within a mask of her own making. And still, she could not relent. To abandon the ceruse was to risk her authority. To persist was to shorten her life. The choice seemed as stark as the black and white contrast of her painted face. Every day, she weighed the fleeting illusion of perfection against the creeping decay within. Through it all, she remained composed. Her tranquil demeanour belied a steely resolve. For Elizabeth Tudor had mastered the art of turning perception into power, and she would not allow reality, no matter how painful, to overturn the myth she had become. Thus, with each passing year, the legend of the White Queen grew more radiant even as her flesh silently eroded. She embraced the paradox that defined her reign. In sacrificing her body to an unrelenting cosmetic ritual, she secured her place in history as a sovereign beyond compare. And though her subjects saw only a timeless monarch, The true Elizabeth Tudor carried the burden of her secret sacrifices, an unspoken testament to the price of glory, and the enduring strength of a queen who would not yield. At the height of her reign, Queen Elizabeth I was not merely admired, she was mythologized. In portraits and pageants, she appeared surrounded by moons and serpents, roses and rainbows. An ageless monarch untouched by infirmity, impervious to time's relentless march. Yet behind that alabaster mask lay a far more fragile truth. Venetian ceruse had become her second skin. Applied in thick layers, day after day, it concealed the scars that marked her flesh. But it also dictated her fate. The white lead mixed with vinegar clung to her cheeks like armor and seeped into her bloodstream like a slow-acting curse. The very substance that preserved her public image was, in fact, destroying her from within. The symptoms of lead poisoning are well documented. Skin lesions, neurological fatigue, digestive disturbances, profound exhaustion, hair loss, and eventually organ failure. It is almost certain that Elizabeth endured many of these afflictions, though she never revealed them to her courtiers or her subjects. To compound the peril, her beauty regimen included rouge and cleansing pastes laced with mercury. Mercury, even more toxic than lead, can corrode the skin, trigger uncontrollable tremors, ravage vital organs, and erode the mind itself. Modern historians now believe that the combination of these elements created a daily ritual of self-destruction disguised as supreme elegance. But Elizabeth could not cease her regimen. Her entire reign depended upon the fragile illusion that she was eternal, that the Virgin Queen would neither wither nor fade. To let the mask slip would be to reveal weakness, and weakness in the Tudor court was tantamount to a death sentence. So she endured. Each morning, her ladies-in-waiting would prepare the ceruse into a thick, paste-like consistency, then gently smooth it across her face, neck, and décolletage. The sour, pungent odor of vinegar hung in the air, seeping into tapestries and draperies, marking the passage of her transformation. When the paste dried, it cracked in fine fissures, peeling away to expose the living flesh beneath. It stung and itched, yet Elizabeth remained impassive, as though wearing the corrosive mask was as natural as donning her royal gown. As the years wore on, the evidence became impossible to ignore. Her once pristine teeth turned black from repeated exposure to lead and mercury. Clumps of her dark hair would fall away, revealing pallid, inflamed patches of scalp. Beneath the layers of ceruse, her skin grew thin and brittle, prone to painful eruptions. Observers noted that her hands trembled ever so slightly, a telltale sign of Mercury's assault on her nervous system. Still, she persisted with unwavering resolve. To her people, she remained the radiant, unchanging embodiment of monarchy. To herself, she was a living sacrifice, her body the altar upon which the cult of Elizabeth was maintained. In public, Elizabeth continued the grand drama of her sovereignty. She commissioned lavish pageants, sponsored poets and playwrights, and welcomed ambassadors with measured graciousness. Each triumph, whether the defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588 or the coronation festivities that followed, reinforced the legend of the White Queen. Her portraits multiplied in courts across Europe, each one depicting her as an immaculate, timeless ruler. Yet in the quiet of her private chambers, the truth of her existence was far more somber. The rituals of beauty that elevated her to near godlike status also carried her inexorably toward decline. On the eve of state banquets, she would sit for hours as her attendants repainted her face, carefully reapplying the ceruse layer by layer. The lead paste would settle into the finest lines of expression, smoothing away the subtle creases that might betray the passage of years. Her hair, once auburn and lustrous, was hidden beneath heavy wigs, styled to perfection, concealing the thinning strands beneath. In candlelight, she seemed impervious to age, her visage reflecting back an image of perfection that no living being could truly possess. Yet every application carried risks beyond the mere physical. Elizabeth's careful maintenance of her image was also a psychological necessity. She knew that the slightest hint of vulnerability could invite criticism or embolden rivals. A queen perceived as mortal might lose the aura of invincibility upon which her authority rested. Thus, the morning ritual of lead-based cosmetics became as indispensable to her rule as the royal scepter. Without it, She risked exposing the fatal contradictions at the heart of her reign, a woman who had triumphed over betrayal, disease, and imprisonment, yet was now trapped within an illusion of her own making. By the final decade of her life, the toll of her daily beauty rites was unmistakable. Her once smooth skin lay marred by inflammation beneath the porcelain veneer. Her hands shook more noticeably, and her steps grew less steady. Yet she remained determined to appear unflinching. At ceremonies, she would stand for long periods, supported only by cushions disguised beneath the heavy brocade of her gowns. She greeted each guest with the same meticulously rehearsed calm, concealing the storm of toxins swirling through her veins. And so Elizabeth Tudor's reign wove together triumph and tragedy, spectacle and sacrifice. The legend of the Virgin Queen shone brilliantly on the world stage, even as her body endured a hidden decay. Her immortal image, a testament to her skill in wielding perception as power, rested upon a foundation of lead and mercury, worn daily like a crown. She had preserved her legacy through artifice and endurance, but the price she paid was her own flesh and blood. Though the world saw only an unchanging sovereign, the reality was that Elizabeth bore within her a slowly unravelling truth, that symbols, no matter how grand, can rot from the inside out. Elizabeth Tudor is remembered to this day as the Virgin Queen, wedded to her realm and bound by no romantic vow. Yet the reality of her heart was far more intricate. Though she never took a husband, Elizabeth loved deeply and often dangerously, and the men who dared enter her affections frequently met ruin. The first name whispered in every corner of the court was that of Robert Dudley. They had known each other since childhood, growing up side by side amid the chaos that followed Henry VIII's reign. When Elizabeth ascended the throne in 1558, Dudley's star rose with her own. She appointed him Master of the Horse, a position that granted him unfettered access to her private chambers at any hour. Court gossip swirled like autumn leaves in the wind. The people speculated on every stolen glance, every furtive smile between sovereign and favourite. Foreign ambassadors dispatched reports suggesting they were lovers. Yet Dudley bore a secret that could not be ignored. He was already Wednesday. In 1560, tragedy struck with the sudden death of his wife, Amy Robsart. She was found at the foot of a staircase, her neck broken. Official verdicts ruled the fall accidental, but rumours spread like wildfire. Was it suicide, or was she pushed? Whispers abounded that Dudley or even Elizabeth herself had orchestrated Amy's demise to clear the path for a royal marriage. The scandal rocked the court to its core. Though Elizabeth never publicly renounced Dudley's favour, she never honoured him with a crown. Perhaps she feared the price that marriage would exact upon her throne. Perhaps she understood that love must yield to duty in the Tudor court. Or perhaps she simply did not trust the very institution that had destroyed her mother, Anne Boleyn. Years passed, and one suitor after another presented himself at her door. Kings, dukes, and princes paraded their credentials and charm before her. Each hoped to become the consort of England's legendary queen. Among them was Francois, Duke of Anjou, the younger brother of the King of France, who arrived in England amidst great fanfare. 20 years her junior and rumoured eccentric, he nonetheless captivated Elizabeth's attention for a brief, curious season. She exchanged rings with him in a public ceremony, a gesture that almost promised marriage only to call off the engagement the very next day. The abrupt reversal fueled fresh rumours, but Elizabeth remained resolute. No foreign prince would share her throne. Then came the coup of Robert Devereux, Earl of Essex Dudley's stepson, who entered her service in 1589. He was brash, charismatic, and daring, and although he won Elizabeth's favour, his reckless ambition soon brought disaster. Sent to Ireland in 1599 to quell a rebellion, he negotiated a truce that angered the Queen. Upon his unauthorised return, he burst into her private apartments, finding her unadorned and vulnerable. The illusion shattered. His later rebellion in 1501 ended in his execution, with Elizabeth, her heart broken, signing his death warrant. Through each of these entanglements, Elizabeth displayed a singular restraint. Though capable of deep feeling, she never allowed passion to eclipse prudence. She understood that marriage could diminish her authority, that love could become a weapon wielded against her. The memory of Anne Boleyn's fate to lose her head in pursuit of the royal heart weighed heavily upon her choices. To wed was to risk repeating that tragic cycle. Instead, Elizabeth fashioned an image of the eternal sovereign, unburdened by marital bonds. Yet beneath the veneer of the Virgin Queen lay a woman who had loved fiercely and paid the price for it. The court's innermost circles whispered of unrequited devotion, of midnight confessions, and of hearts broken in hushed corridors. Dudley remained her constant, the one whose presence stilled her courtly anxieties and softened the weight of her crown. Yet he never became her consort. As the decades wore on, Elizabeth's suitors dwindled. The grand negotiations of marriage gave way to diplomatic alliances. She cultivated friendships with nobles who understood the precariousness of their positions, rewarding loyalty more than lineage. She mastered the art of keeping her heart just out of reach, using the magic of possibility to bind her subjects to her cause. And though she celebrated her status as the Virgin Queen married solely to her kingdom, she was, in truth, wedded to the memory of every love that had been denied, every promise laid to rest in quiet despair. In her solitude, Elizabeth often reflected on the paradox of power, that to inspire devotion, she had to remain unattainable, yet to rule effectively, she could not entirely extinguish the flame of hopeful affection in others. She walked the tightrope of her own making, balancing personal sacrifice against the enduring stability of her reign. Through her deft navigation of courtly intrigue and her unwavering commitment to the image she had crafted, she maintained a grip on her kingdom that outlasted every would-be suitor. And so, Elizabeth Tudor's legacy as the Virgin Queen endured, not simply because she never married, but because in her lifelong dance with love and power, she revealed the depths of her intelligence and the resilience of her spirit. She loved as ardently as any woman, yet she sacrificed that love to safeguard the realm. In the annals of history, her heart's true story remains veiled in legend and rumour, a testament to the truth that in the Tudor court, love was both a blessing and a curse, one that Elizabeth Tudor bore with unmatched dignity and unyielding resolve. In 1579, a new suitor emerged on the stage of Elizabeth's court. Francois, Duke of Anjou, the younger brother of the King of France. 20 years her junior, rumoured eccentric, pockmarked by smallpox scars and viewed as a political inconvenience, Francois nonetheless captured Elizabeth's curiosity and, it seemed, her affection. She affectionately referred to him as "my frog," a whimsical pet name echoing a fond intimacy that startled her counsellors. When Francois visited England that summer, Elizabeth did not hide her intentions. She publicly declared her desire to wed him. The court buzzed with excitement as the two exchanged rings in a lavish ceremony that felt to all the world like a royal betrothal. Peals of trumpets heralded the prospect of a French alliance, and nobles began preparations for a wedding of unprecedented splendour. Yet on the very next day, the engagement was abruptly called off. No official explanation was offered beyond vague references to political complications. Some whispered of French objections, others spoke of Elizabeth's own doubts. To the dismay of her subjects and the delight of her detractors, the young Duke returned to France without a bride. That swift reversal was the final time Elizabeth would publicly entertain the notion of marriage. But even as the dream of Anjou faded, Elizabeth soon found herself embroiled in a far more perilous romance, that of Robert Devereux, Earl of Essex, stepson of her long-time favourite, Robert Dudley. When Essex arrived at court in 1589, Elizabeth was 56 and Essex a mere 22. Despite their generation's divide, their bond was electric intense, theatrical, and dangerously volatile. Elizabeth elevated him to the rank of favourite almost instantly, showering him with titles and privileges. She forgave his brashness, rewarded his audacity, and, in a gesture that stunned the court, appointed him commander-in-chief of her armies. Essex, emboldened by her favour, acted with reckless confidence. He squandered opportunities in Ireland in 1599, returning abruptly to England without authorization. In doing so, he trampled the careful protocols of the court, catching Elizabeth unawares, literally so, as he burst through her chamber doors to find her without her customary wig and face paint. The rupture of that illusion infuriated Elizabeth. She could tolerate daring exploits, but she could not abide deception in her private chambers. The climax of their tempestuous relationship came when Essex married Lady Frances Walsingham in secret, an act of profound betrayal. When Elizabeth discovered the clandestine union, she flew into a rage of tears and shouts, emotions rare for the ever-composed sovereign. Essex, desperate to reclaim her favour, penned love poems dripping with devotion and contrition. His verses spoke of undying loyalty, of regret for his own folly, and of a hope that Elizabeth's mercy would outlast his transgression. Moved by his words, and mindful of the volatility of his support base, Elizabeth forgave him, restoring him to favour and entrusting him with command of the royal armies once more. Their reconciliation, however, proved fleeting. Essex's fortunes waned as his ambitions outstripped his prudence. His unauthorised departure for Ireland, his abortive marriage, and his brazenness before the Queen eroded Elizabeth's trust. When he led a failed rebellion in 1501, attempting to seize London itself, Elizabeth could no longer shield him with her forgiveness. She signed his death warrant, condemning him to the block on the 25th of February in 1501. Yet in her private grief, she is said to have mourned him deeply, refusing food and music in her chambers for days on end, whispering his name in a lamentation that no courtier dared interrupt. Through these romantic entanglements, first with the pockmarked Duke of Anjou, then with the impetuous Earl of Essex, Elizabeth's heart experienced both hope and heartbreak. She demonstrated that even a sovereign could be vulnerable to affection's powerful sway, yet she also proved her ability to place duty above desire. The failed engagement to Francois revealed that politics could not be subordinated to passion, while the tragedy of Essex underscored the peril inherent in elevating personal favourites to positions of unbridled power. By never choosing a husband, Elizabeth reinforced her persona as the Virgin Queen, bound not to a man but to her realm. Her flirtations with marriage served to strengthen her diplomatic hand without ceding any real control. The court was alternately enraptured and scandalized by her romantic liaisons, but always reminded that Elizabeth's ultimate loyalty belonged to England alone. She wielded love and longing as instruments of statecraft, allowing suitors to hope, then dashing their aspirations when it served her greater aims. In her final decades, Elizabeth would grow more circumspect in matters of the heart. She maintained warm, respectful relationships with noblemen, but she drew clear boundaries that few dared to test. Her legend as a sovereign untouched by romantic entanglement grew, even as the true story of her affections of Duke Francois's abrupt departure and of Essex's dramatic downfall became whispered legend within the palace walls. Historians and poets would long recall her private sorrows and public triumphs, entwining fact and myth in a tapestry as rich and complex as the reign itself. Thus, Elizabeth Tudor's navigations of love and politics stand as one of the most fascinating aspects of her rule. Each suitor, Francois, Duke of Anjou, and Robert Devereux, Earl of Essex, played a part in her evolution from a young princess abandoned by her parents to a masterful monarch who bent perception and affection to the service of her sovereign will. Through triumphs and tragedies of the heart, Elizabeth emerged not as a passive victim of courtly intrigues, but as the active architect of her own legend, ever the Virgin Queen, ever the ruler wedded to her nation alone. But Essex's recklessness with power knew no bounds. In 1599, Elizabeth appointed him to lead an expedition to quell a rebellion in Ireland, a mission she entrusted to his command with her full confidence. Yet instead of achieving victory, he negotiated a truce that many deemed dishonourable. Worse still, he returned to England unannounced, bursting into the Queen's private apartments in a state of dishevelment. His clothes were stained with the grime of the campaign, his hair mussed by wind and rain, and his face bore the exhaustion of a hastily arranged journey. Elizabeth, taken entirely by surprise, stood before him without her customary wig, her jewels set aside for the evening, her face unpainted. No man had ever seen her so unguarded, so vulnerable. In that moment, the illusion she had so carefully constructed shattered. The Virgin Queen, ever poised, ever immaculate, stood exposed to the crude realities of flesh and blood. Essex's intrusion was more than a breach of protocol. It was a betrayal of trust so profound that Elizabeth never truly recovered. The court would whisper of that evening for years to come, recounting how the Queen's composure faltered, how a single tear escaped her stoic gaze before she regained her regal bearing. From that night onward, Essex was forever tainted in her eyes, not quite favoured, never quite forgiven. 2 years later, in 1601, Essex launched a rebellion against his sovereign. He sought to seize the city of London, hoping to force Elizabeth's hand and overturn the power structures that he felt had betrayed him. Under the cover of night on the 8th of February, he and his followers marched toward the capital, expecting citizen support to swell their ranks. But the uprising collapsed within hours. Loyalist forces surrounded the conspirators, and Essex, realizing the futility of his gamble, surrendered. His cohort was scattered, his followers captured or slain, and the rebellion ended as swiftly as it had begun. This time, Elizabeth's mercy was nowhere to be found. The betrayal cut too deep. The public breach was too brazen. On the 25th of February in 1601, Robert Devereux, Earl of Essex, was led to the scaffold at Westminster. The crowd stood hushed in shock as the executioner's blade fell, severing the head of the once favoured courtier. It was a ruthless demonstration of royal authority, meant to deter future insurrection and reaffirm Elizabeth's unchallengeable rule. Yet even as she sanctioned his death, Elizabeth's heart stirred with private sorrow. In the days that followed, the Queen retreated into the shadowed stillness of her private chambers. She refused bread and wine, deeming herself unworthy of sustenance. Music, once a balm to her spirit, was banned from the palace halls. Courtiers who dared approach her found the chamber doors locked and the rooms darkened, save for a single candle flickering on an empty table. Some reported that Elizabeth sat for hours by the hearth, her gown trailing in a pool of silence, her eyes fixed on the dying embers. She spoke little, and when she did, her voice trembled with grief as she murmured Essex's name again and again, as though invoking his memory might summon him back from death. Those who glimpsed her during these private moments described a sovereign undone by sorrow. The Queen, who had mastered the art of composure, now allowed her tears to fall unashamed. She wept for the man who had captured both her favour and her heart, for the young nobleman who had dared to defy her command, for the sun-like figure she had nurtured from adolescence. Her mourning was a silent protest against the finality of his end, a testament to the depth of her feelings she had long concealed beneath the mantle of duty. Despite her profound anguish, Elizabeth knew she could not relinquish her crown to the pangs of personal grief. The stability of the realm demanded that the Queen emerge from her seclusion, dignified and unbroken. Within a fortnight of Essex's execution, she resumed her duties with a solemn resolve, greeting ambassadors, commissioning court paintings, and presiding over Privy Council meetings. Yet the courtiers perceived a change in her, bearing a quiet solemnity that replaced her once familiar warmth. The bright sparkle in her eyes had dimmed, and the resonance of her voice carried a weight that had not been there before. Essex's rebellion and execution marked the end of Elizabeth's willingness to tolerate personal affronts. From that day on, she resolved to keep her court at arm's length, to guard her affections with the same vigilance she had once reserved for her safety. She limited audiences with favourites and favoured a smaller circle of trusted advisers. Her private life receded behind ever closer doors and more stringent protocols. Even the ceremonial rituals of makeup and adornment, which she had once embraced as symbols of her unassailable image, became opportunities for strict observance rather than expressions of personal vanity. Yet, in the interplay of power and loss, Elizabeth found new clarity. She understood that love, even for a favoured courtier, could never trump the supreme duty she owed to her kingdom. She carried within her the bitter remembrance of Anne Boleyn, felled by her own pursuit of a king's affections, and the cautionary example of Dudley, ensnared in scandal and suspicion. Essex's fate served as a stark reminder that the lines between loyalty and treachery, between devotion and danger, were perilously thin. The Queen had navigated these treacherous waters for decades. Now she reaffirmed her command, employing her fierce intelligence and unparalleled tenacity to guide England through the final years of her reign. And so, in the wake of Essex's downfall, Elizabeth Tudor emerged both hardened and resolute. She had witnessed the destructive potential of unguarded affection, the cost of misplaced trust, and the fragility of human bonds in the crucible of statecraft. She resumed her role not merely as sovereign, but as a living emblem of endurance, her image intact, her crown unchallenged. Her subjects, well aware of the private tragedies that had punctuated her rule, regarded her with renewed awe, for she had survived not only rebellions and assassins, but also the deepest wounds of the heart. In the annals of history, the final years of Elizabeth's reign would be remembered as a testament to the unbreakable will of a woman who wedded herself to her nation and to her own unyielding sense of duty above all else. In the early 17th century, Elizabeth was no longer the vibrant queen of gilded portraits and grand processions. Time had etched its lines upon her, and the restless energy that once propelled her reign had given way to a deep, pervasive stillness. The court chambers, once alive with laughter and music, had grown hushed. Her closest confidants and friends had passed from this world, or drifted beyond her reach. The glittering light of her golden reign dimmed, replaced by the slow, heavy shadow of advancing years. After the execution of Robert Devereux, Earl of Essex, in 1601, something within Elizabeth shifted irrevocably. She began to withdraw from public life, declining invitations to ceremonies and courtly entertainments. Her famous smile vanished, and her appetite, once hearty enough to match her iron will, all but disappeared. Behind the palace walls, the woman who had commanded empires now shrank within the solitary confines of her chambers, enveloped by the echo of her own silence. At the outset of 1603, tragedy struck again. Catherine Carey, one of Elizabeth's dearest friends and most devoted ladies-in-waiting, passed away. More than a mere attendant, Catherine was like family, a living link to Elizabeth's childhood, to the memory of her mother, and to the simple humanity that the crown often overshadowed. The loss shattered Elizabeth's fragile composure. In her grief, the Queen, who had endured betrayals, rebellions, and the slow poisoning of her own image, found herself undone by the death of one she loved. As the court whispered of Catherine's passing, Elizabeth retreated fully into her private chambers, closing her doors to all but the most essential servants. What followed were the Queen's final days, endless hours spent standing in the dim light of her bedchamber, refusing to lie upon her bed. She believed that to rest in sleep would be to surrender to the grave. Thus, she stood for up to 15 hours at a stretch, supported by hidden cushions and surrounded by ladies-in-waiting who watched helplessly as her strength ebbed away. The great physician's texts lay untouched. Any attempt at medical examination was sternly forbidden. Elizabeth refused all remedies, whether herbs, poultices, or the ministrations of the realm's finest doctors. Some claimed it was pride that drove her, the same fierce pride that had carried her through 45 years of rule. Others said it was fear that if she ever lulled her defences, time would claim her body utterly. Perhaps it was both. A final defiance against the ravages that had claimed so much of her life, and a stubborn will to stand against the darkness closing in. In those twilight hours, Elizabeth's court existed only in memory. The corridors, once adorned with tapestries and heraldic banners, lay silent. The musicians she once patronized no longer played their lutes outside her door. Instead, the hush was broken only by the soft rustle of silk gowns and the muffled footsteps of her attendants as they tended to her needs. Candlelight flickered against the walls, casting long, trembling shadows that danced like ghosts in the corners of the room. The Queen, once a formidable figure of regal authority, appeared diminutive and fragile, her frame draped in sombre black, her once lustrous hair hidden beneath a simple coif. Yet even in her weakness, she retained the regal bearing that had defined her reign. Her chin lifted, her shoulders squared, and her gaze determined, though dimmed by exhaustion. Each tick of the palace clock seemed to echo the finality of her solitude. Elizabeth spoke seldom, and when she did, her voice was but a faint whisper carried on the still air. She murmured of Catherine Carey's kindness, of Essex's memory, of days when the court had thronged to her side, eager for her presence. In her monologue, she made no mention of the elaborate pageantry that had once defined her rule. Instead, she spoke of simple truths of loyalty and betrayal, of love and loss, and of the unyielding loneliness of power. In these confessions, she laid bare the heart of a woman who had worn a crown heavier than any monarch before her, and who now bore the burden of her own mortality. When Elizabeth finally permitted herself a moment of rest, it was only to cast her gaze once more upon the night sky. Through a narrow window high in her chamber, she watched the stars shift in their silent vigil. Each shining point reminded her of the years she had survived, the storms she had weathered, and the sacrifices she had made. She had outlasted suitors and sparred with princes, had quashed rebellions and steered her nation through crises. Yet here, in the final chapter of her life, she confronted the one conquest she could not evade, the inexorable approach of death. As the candle's flame guttered low, Elizabeth Tudor, the Virgin Queen, stood poised between the world she had shaped and the quiet darkness awaiting her. Though her body trembled with fatigue, her spirit remained unbowed. In that liminal space between life and death, she embodied the essence of her reign, resolute, unyielding, and singularly unmatched. And as she took her last breaths in the hush of her chambers, She carried with her the weight of 45 years of history, the glimmering triumphs, the hidden sacrifices, and the legacy of a queen who truly became her crown. She, the woman who had survived betrayals, imprisonment, and assassination plots, was now being defeated not by any enemy, but by her own body. Witnesses spoke of her gaunt frame, her fragile form, her skin as thin as parchment, her once bright eyes now dimmed by fatigue and illness. The elaborate gowns that once swept through palace halls, and the leaden masks she wore like armour, had vanished. In their place stood a spectral echo of the Queen. The world had once worshipped a pale, trembling figure, wrapped in simple black, a ghost of her former self. In those final hours, Elizabeth spoke little. Court records note that she uttered only a handful of words. Yet one name she repeated again and again: Essex. Whether it was an echo of remorse for the man she had executed, a yearning for the loyalty he had once shown, or a final utterance of punishment upon herself, we will never know. The single syllable hung in the hush of her private chambers like a lamentation, rising and falling with the flicker of candlelight. It was a testament to the depth of her feelings, a queen who, to the very end, clung to the memory of the favourite she had once elevated above all others. On the 24th of March in 1603, after 45 years upon the throne, Queen Elizabeth I drew her last breath at Richmond Palace. She was 69 years old. With her passing, it was not only a monarch who departed this world, but the entire Tudor dynasty that came to an end. No husband stood by her side, no heir awaited her final command, and no successor bore a royal title written by her hand. Instead, she left behind a legacy enshrouded in mystery and a silence as deep as the grave. The death of Elizabeth Tudor marked the close of a remarkable era, an age that had known the triumph of the Spanish Armada, the flowering of Elizabethan drama, and the forging of a national identity under her steadfast guidance. Yet with her departure, a new riddle emerged. Amid the sorrow and the ceremony, her closest advisers, hardened men who had governed wars and outlived plagues, discovered something in her private apartments that would haunt history. A single letter, unsealed, unsigned, unaddressed, simply waiting upon her desk. Those advisers, men accustomed to reading dispatches from foreign courts and issuing commands that shaped the fate of nations, fell silent as they unfolded the fragile sheet of parchment. Nothing in their long careers had prepared them for the chill that gripped their hearts at what they found inside. No words have survived in public record. No copy was made, no reference ever published. The original vanished almost immediately, carried away into the vaults of the Privy Council, if it was carried away at all. Speculation about the letter's contents has persisted for generations. Some have claimed it was a confession that Elizabeth herself admitted to the silent, slow murder she had suffered at the hands of her own beauty rituals. Others argue it named a successor in secret, a final act of duty performed with characteristic discretion, and still others whisper that it revealed a truth too dangerous for public eyes. Perhaps a secret about the death of Amy Robsart, or a final reflection on the fate of Robert Dudley, or even a confession of her deepest regrets. Yet, whatever lay in those lines of ink, it was never shared. The court advisers who read it spoke no word of its contents, not to the council, not to the clergy, and certainly not to the common people. The letter was folded away, its meaning locked behind the Queen's final act of silence. In that deliberate choice lay the apex of her power. She had commanded attention by her words, by her presence, and ultimately by her absence of words when it mattered most. After the Queen's death, England looked to her successor, James of Scotland, whose ascension as James I united the crowns of England and Scotland, opening a new chapter in British history. Yet the Tudor age, with its bold risks and fierce loyalties, could not simply be replicated. The English people remembered the Queen who had backed the arts and encouraged free thought, but who had also navigated a world of peril with a calm that felt almost supernatural. They recounted her speeches, her visions of a united realm, and the legendary countenance she maintained through every trial. In the funeral processions that wound through London, the city marked the end of one dynasty and the dawn of another. Bells tolled in lamentation, banners fluttered at half-mast, and actors performed elegies in the public squares. Yet even amid the pageantry, the unanswered questions lingered. What had Elizabeth written in that solitary letter? Whose name, if any, did she place above all others? What was her final message to the world she had ruled so triumphantly? Historians would pore over scraps of correspondence, dispatches from foreign ambassadors, and the diaries of courtiers in hopes of uncovering a clue. Yet the vaults remained locked. The paper ghost of Elizabeth's last testament faded into legend, its truth swallowed by time. And so the Queen, who had commanded with eloquence and guile, who had masked her vulnerability behind cosmetics both beautiful and toxic, ensured that her final act would be one of utter, unbroken silence. Queen Elizabeth I, the Virgin Queen who had mastered both mercy and ruthlessness, who had stoked the fires of cultural rebirth while taming rebellions and rivalries, chose to keep her final secret close to her heart. In death, she wielded the same power she had in life, the power of mystery, and as the Tudor era gave way to the Stuart age, the enigma of her last letter became a symbol of her unparalleled sovereignty, an echo of a woman who had shaped an age and then slipped away, leaving behind only shadows and questions in her wake. The contents of that final letter have never been officially disclosed. No copy has survived. No public mention was ever made. Yet its existence is whispered in Tudor chronicles, courtly gossip, and the footnotes of forgotten diaries. What then did it say? Some believe it was a confession, a solemn admission that the very cosmetics Elizabeth had used for decades had been poisoning her, that she had known the danger, that she had willingly sacrificed her own flesh and blood to preserve the pristine image she presented to the world. To pen such a truth in her final moments would have been the ultimate act of honesty, a queen's secret laid bare for the ages. Others insist it was a farewell, a rare glimpse into the heart of a woman who had lived behind layers of powder and paint, whose solitude was not performance, but a wound that never truly healed. In those opening lines, they imagine a tender goodbye to the friends and servants who had stood by her through triumph and trial, a whispered blessing for those she loved, but could never fully trust with her vulnerability. Still others claim it was political in nature that Elizabeth, in her last act of sovereignty, discreetly named a successor, breaking her long-held silence to ensure a smooth transition. In those final moments, she might have revealed a plan so unexpected that even her closest counselors would have stood speechless at its audacity. And then there are those who murmur of something darker, a revelation too perilous for public ears. Perhaps she wrote of her true lineage, questioning the legitimacy of her birth. Perhaps she unveiled new evidence about the death of Amy Robsart, or perhaps she confessed to knowledge of Robert Dudley's fate more damning than any court scandal. Such a secret, they say, was too dangerous to record, too powerful to trust to parchment, so it vanished as quickly as it appeared. Whatever the letter contained, it was never released. It slipped from history's grasp, swallowed by time and sealed behind the Queen's final silence. Yet its weight remains, an invisible burden that lingers over her legacy. For 45 years, Elizabeth Tudor built her reign on the twin pillars of silence and strength. She outlasted her foes, she outwitted her rivals, she defied expectations at every turn. She turned her life into legend, every gesture, every portrait, every procession meticulously orchestrated, every secret carefully guarded. And yet, perhaps in her very last act, she allowed herself to speak. Perhaps that letter was the one place where Elizabeth Tudor ceased to be sovereign and permitted herself to be human. In the gentle slant of her handwriting, in the pauses between her lines, we might have found her truest voice. No longer the timeless monarch she had cultivated, but a woman who had loved, lost, and endured too much to remain silent forever. Imagine the quill trembling in her hand as she wrote those final words, each stroke a confession, a tribute, a warning, or perhaps all three. Picture her in the candlelit chamber, the hush broken only by the soft scratching of ink on parchment and the distant echo of palace footsteps. In that private moment she would have been neither queen nor icon, but simply Elizabeth alone with her thoughts, her regrets, and the clarity that comes only at the edge of mortality. Yet the letter was never meant for public eyes. It was a secret for the silent, a testament kept from the world that had demanded so much of her. The hardened advisors who discovered it, men who had governed wars, endured plagues, and served 5 decades of Tudor rule, sealed it away. They read it, and then they were still. Their silence became as profound as hers, a collective vow to protect the sanctity of her last confession. Through the centuries, historians have tried to reconstruct that vanished text from scraps of evidence, a marginal note here, a veiled reference there. But the truth eludes them. No matter how fervently they search the archives, no matter how boldly they speculate, the letter remains out of reach. A phantom tethered to the final breath of a queen who knew the power of silence better than any monarch before her. In the end, the enigma of Elizabeth's last letter is inseparable from the enigma of Elizabeth herself. She was a queen who reigned through storms of religion and rebellion, a queen who waged wars abroad, even as she managed delicate alliances at home. She was a woman who mastered the art of projection, transforming her image into an unassailable fortress. And yet, she was also a woman who felt deeply, who carried her losses like scars beneath the painted mask. Perhaps that letter was her surrender, an acknowledgement that even the most formidable sovereign must eventually yield to mortality. Or perhaps it was her final triumph, the last command from a queen who, even in death, controlled her narrative. By leaving only a silent testament, she ensured that generations would wonder, would question, and would remember her not for what she had said, but for the mystery she left behind. Elizabeth Tudor's legacy, then, becomes a tapestry woven of triumph, tragedy, and profound silence. She lived beyond betrayals, beyond imprisonments, beyond the diminishing effects of time itself, and in the quiet of her last act, she offered to the world a riddle, a letter that spoke volumes precisely because it never spoke at all. In that void lies her greatest power, the power to compel us to ask what she might have written, to imagine her voice unguarded, and to acknowledge that some secrets are meant to endure in silence, echoing softly through the corridors of history. Queen Elizabeth I reigned for 45 years. She survived assassination plots, rival claimants, court scandals, and protracted sieges. Through dogged resolve and unflinching poise, she brought stability to a realm beset by religious strife and political upheaval, etching her name indelibly into the annals of history. She was not the wife of a powerful consort, nor the mother of a royal heir, but the sovereign of England in her own right. The last Tudor monarch, daughter of an executed queen, she was the unlikely girl who ascended to power, and yet she did so with unwavering determination. Under Elizabeth's leadership, England emerged as a burgeoning global power. The arts flourished in her patronage, giving rise to an era now celebrated as the Elizabethan Golden Age. William Shakespeare penned his greatest tragedies and comedies, immortalizing her England in lines that would echo through the centuries. The Spanish Armada, the formidable fleet sent by King Philip of Spain to overthrow her, was vanquished in 1588, bolstering national pride and cementing Elizabeth's reputation as a capable commander of both war and diplomacy. Her court became the crucible for literature, music, and scientific inquiry, drawing luminaries from across Europe to bask in the glow of her patronage. Yet for all her public triumphs, Elizabeth's personal life remained her greatest mystery. She chose never to marry, embracing the persona of the Virgin Queen, a title that served her political aims as much as it defined her image. In refusing to ally herself through marriage, she kept foreign powers at bay and preserved her autonomy. Her self-styled celibacy became a powerful symbol. She was wedded to her country, not to a man. This declaration of singular devotion resonated deeply with her subjects, who saw in her an almost divine figure, a monarch whose loyalty lay solely with the realm she governed. Despite her crafted exterior of strength and composure, Elizabeth felt deeply. She loved with intensity and carried her sorrows like a second skin. The men who captured her affection, Robert Dudley, Duke Francois, Robert Devereux, each left an imprint on her heart, only to depart amid scandal or rebellion. These bonds, forged in the crucible of courtly intrigue, brought her moments of joy and episodes of betrayal. Yet she never allowed despair to cripple her rule. Instead, she channeled her emotions into the responsibilities of state. Elizabeth's endurance was legendary. She had weathered plots to replace her with rival claimants, conspiracies that might have toppled a lesser ruler. She had navigated the treacherous currents of religious conflict, carefully balancing her policies to maintain peace between Protestant and Catholic factions. She had outmaneuvered foreign powers who coveted England's wealth and influence, forging strategic alliances while projecting an image of inviolable authority. Through every challenge, she maintained a persona of unshakable grace, even as the weight of her burdens grew heavier with each passing year. Her reign, spanning from 1558 to 1603, set the stage for a modern nation. Under her aegis, England expanded its maritime reach, planting the seeds for colonies that would one day stretch across the Atlantic. Merchants ventured further afield, bringing back spices, silks, and new wealth. Explorers charted unknown waters in the name of the crown. All the while, Elizabeth stood at the helm, a beacon of stability in a world of shifting alliances and religious fervour. Yet the legend of the Virgin Queen masked a woman who had known profound loneliness. Her closest allies and confidantes, nurtured in the intimate circle of her court, passed on or fell from favour. She outlived many who had stood at her side in the early days of her reign. As her personal circle shrank, she relied increasingly on the veneer of ceremonial duty. The masks she wore in public, both literal and figurative, served to hide the vulnerability that lay beneath. Even so, Elizabeth's final years were marked by a diminishing of her once immaculate image. The lead-based ceruse that had preserved her unaging visage took its toll, and the brilliant robes she once donned became more sombre in colour and style. Yet she continued to present herself as the eternal monarch, offering her people what little reassurance remained in her dwindling strength. Her decisions in these later years, whether in foreign policy, in royal patronage, or in matters of succession, were suffused with the wisdom of a ruler who had seen both the heights of victory and the depths of personal sorrow. When she spoke to her House of Parliament in 1598, Elizabeth's words were no less stirring for the years etched upon her face. She reminded her subjects that they had never been loyal to her father or mother, but to the institution of monarchy itself, and that they would stand true to her as long as she led with justice and foresight. In that speech lay the essence of her approach, a sovereign who recognized that her power derived from the people's respect and the stability she maintained. Elizabeth's legacy was not defined by marriages or heirs, but by the flourishing of her realm and the endurance of her spirit. She was a monarch who embodied the promise of national unity, transcending the factionalism that had torn England apart under her predecessors. She was a patron of the arts whose court rivaled any in Europe, leaving an imprint on literature and culture that outlasted her own mortal span. She was a strategist in matters of statecraft, deftly balancing power both within and beyond her borders. When the final chapter of her life closed at Richmond Palace on the 24th of March in 1603, the world she had shaped faced a new dawn, but her imprint remained indelible. The last Tudor monarch had departed, and the crown passed to a new dynasty. Yet the resonance of her reign, the stability she engendered, the cultural awakening she nurtured, and the enigmatic persona she projected would echo through the centuries. Elizabeth Tudor, the Virgin Queen who ruled alone, left a legacy unmatched in its breadth and complexity. Her life was a testament to the potential of a ruler who, though bound by no consort, bound her people ever closer to the idea of England, a nation forged under her iron will and her unyielding vision. She was never merely the queen in white ruffs and pearls. She was the child who stood at the scaffold and watched her mother's life ebb away in 1636. She was the young woman confined within the stone walls of the Tower, uncertain whether each morning would bring freedom or a death sentence. She was the sovereign who outlasted every man who dared to profess love for her, and perhaps it is this singular combination of roles that rendered her so unforgettable. Not simply a ruler, but a living, breathing embodiment of every trial she had endured. Elizabeth Tudor did more than don a crown, she became it. Her life unfolded as a grand performance of perfection, flawless and emblematic. Each gesture deliberate, each appearance meticulously choreographed. When she emerged at state occasions, the hush that fell upon the crowd was as much for the myth she had cultivated as for the monarch herself. Yet beneath the layers of leaded makeup, the sumptuous gowns, and the blazing jewels beat the heart of a woman of extraordinary intellect, of profound sorrow, and of an indomitable strength that few could ever match. From her earliest days, she learned that power and vulnerability were inextricably linked. The execution of Anne Boleyn, her mother charged with crimes untrue, taught the young princess the brutal cost of royal favour. Imprisonment in the Tower under Mary Tudor's reign taught her the precariousness of status, the knife edge upon which her life balanced. Yet in each ordeal, she absorbed a piece of resilience that would later define her rule. She emerged not broken but tempered like steel forged in fire. Throughout 45 years of rule, she faced plots that might have cost lesser souls their lives. She navigated factional rivalries that threatened to rend her realm asunder. She confronted an armada dispatched by Spain, quelling the tide that sought to wash away her Protestant England. And she did so not as a queen by marriage, but as a queen by right, self-made, self-reliant, and singular in her authority. Yet her personal narrative remained the most compelling chapter of all. Elizabeth chose to remain unwed, billing herself the Virgin Queen married to her country alone. In her staunch refusal to contract a royal marriage, she safeguarded her autonomy. But within that deliberate solitude lay a profound loneliness. The suitors who sought her hand, Duke Anjou, Earl of Essex and others, were like notes in a grand symphony, rising to crescendos of possibility only to fall into silences of disappointment. With each broken promise, Elizabeth learned that her heart was as perilous to wield as any political weapon. The greatest irony of her reign was that the very image she projected, the untouchable sovereign draped in opulence, was powered by sacrifices few could imagine. The white ceruse she applied to her skin was both her armor and her poison. Each application masked the ravages of smallpox and age, while insidiously corroding her flesh and spirit. The sumptuous gowns she wore signified her status, yet they also concealed a form grown gaunt and fragile with time. Every element of her persona served a singular purpose: to sustain the illusion of unbreakable majesty even as her mortal vessel ached and weakened. When at last she drew her final breath on the 24th of March in 1603, it was not an enemy's blade, nor a foreign disease that claimed her, but the silent inexorability of her own body. Witnesses described a figure diminished, her skin like parchment, her eyes dulled by the countless burdens she had borne. Gone was the painted mask of youth. In its place stood a ghost of the queen the world had once adored. Yet even in death, Elizabeth commanded attention. For in her private apartments, her closest advisers discovered a single letter, unsealed, unsigned, and unaddressed, lying upon her writing desk. Its contents were never revealed. No copy survives, no public note was ever made. But the mere existence of that final missive has endured in the hushed memories of Tudor chronicles, in the whispers of courtly gossip, and in the annotations of diaries long since forgotten. What did she write in those closing lines? Was it a confession of the self-inflicted demise wrought by lead and mercury, a last acknowledgement of the price she had paid to preserve her image? Or was it a tender farewell to those she held dear, a moment of vulnerability in which she laid bare the loneliness she had hidden behind layers of protocol and paint? Perhaps it was a final exercise of queenly power, a secret naming of a successor to ensure the realm's stability. Or was it something darker still, a revelation too perilous ever to see the light of day, a truth about her lineage, a hidden detail of Amy Robsart's death, or a confession connected to the fate of Robert Dudley? No matter the theory, the letter vanished as swiftly as it was found, consumed by the very silence it embodied. The men who read it, battle-hardened veterans of war and plague, seemed to grasp the weight of its secrets, for they spoke of it to no one. Their collective silence became the final chamber of Elizabeth's legacy. A queen who had wielded silence as deftly as any dagger, who had spoken volumes through what she chose not to say. Elizabeth Tudor's story is the tapestry of contradictions. The girl who became a queen, the queen who remained a woman, the sovereign who embraced solitude as a shield, and the icon who masked her vulnerability and radiance. In her life and in her death, she taught us that power often demands performance, that every public triumph hides private sacrifice, and that the truest legacy may lie in the mysteries we leave behind. And so we remember her, Elizabeth, the queen in white and pearls, the survivor of scaffold and tower, the monarch who outlived every man she loved, the architect of a realm reborn. But most of all, we remember that her final act, that solitary letter, remains the greatest enigma of all. It is the last refrain in the aria of her life, a reminder that some secrets, like some rulers, endure beyond the end of their days, lingering in the hush between each whispered "Essex" and every silent footfall through the empty corridors of history. So now, the question is yours. What do you believe was penned in that final message? Was it a single name, perhaps the last echo of a love she could never publicly claim? Could it have been a dire warning, an admonition against forces unseen that she feared would rise in her absence? Maybe it was a tender memory, a fleeting recollection of someone who had stood by her amid the fiercest storms of court intrigue. Or was it a truth so profound, so unsettling, that she dared not speak it aloud until her last breath, an admission that might have toppled thrones or shattered alliances if ever revealed? Imagine, for a moment, that the letter bore the name of Robert Dudley, whispered again as a confession of undying devotion. Consider the possibility that she wrote of the poison in her leaden ceruse, confessing to the slow murder of her body, in exchange for a flawless visage. Perhaps she revealed the secret of Amy Robsart's death, exposing a conspiracy that still smoulders in the footnotes of history. Or contemplate the notion that her final act was to name a successor, someone hidden from public view, a strategic masterpiece designed to secure the realm's future without the pomp of a public decree. Each theory carries its own weight. A confession of love would show us the Queen as a woman first, unveiling the vulnerability she cloaked in regality. A revelation of treachery would recast her as the ultimate truth-teller, shattering the myths she herself had nurtured. A political bequest, quietly naming her heir, would prove her mastery of statecraft to the end, an architect of power, even in her fading moments. And a darker secret one about her lineage, or about the fates of those who loved her, would remind us that no crown, however sparkling, can fully shield its wearer from the shadows that lie beneath. Now it's your turn to fill in the blanks of history's greatest royal mystery. What theory resonates most with you? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We want to hear your take on Elizabeth's last message. Did she write a name, a warning, a memory, or a truth too perilous for any living soul to speak aloud? What would you have done, standing in her royal chambers, quill in hand, with the weight of a dynasty pressing upon you? And so, as our journey through the life and legacy of Queen Elizabeth I draws to a close, let us slow our breath and allow the echoes of her story to settle gently around us. In her 45 years upon the throne, she taught us that true strength often wears a quiet veil, that courage can be born in the hush between heartbeats, and that every crown, no matter how brilliant, rests upon a lifetime of sacrifice and resilience. Her choices remind us of the power of a single voice, whether spoken aloud in royal halls or whispered on the page of a private letter, and the enduring impact of secrets, both kept and revealed. Now, as the final images of powdered masks and gilded processions begin to fade into the soft twilight of memory, let us carry forward the lessons of compassion, tempered by wisdom, of loyalty balanced with discernment, and of the grace that blossoms when we embrace both our vulnerabilities and our triumphs. In the gentle hush of the night, may you find comfort in knowing that even the most formidable among us needs moments of rest, and that our own stories like hers are woven from threads of courage, curiosity, and quiet reflection. So let your thoughts drift, like petals on a still pond, until they rest softly upon the shores of peaceful dreams. Thank you for sharing this time and this tale with us. If you've enjoyed this gentle voyage through history's hidden corridors, please subscribe to our channel so that you never miss the newest stories we uncover together. And now, as the world outside grows still and the stars tiptoe across the sky, I wish you the sweetest of slumbers good night. And sleep well, dear friends, sleep well. Whispered.